Welcome back, everyone. And after this very inspiring talk by Julia about system change, we'll now talk more about what can we do within the system and using the system against itself. And to talk about that, we have the great Ben Franta, who is an associate professor and the founder of the Oxford Litigation Lab. And he has an incredibly exciting path there, and he has probably also seen more freshman college orientation weeks than most. So after his bachelor, he did a master in archaeology in Oxford. Then he did a PhD in physics at Harvard and a second PhD in the history of science at Stanford, followed by a law degree also from Stanford. And he's a licensed attorney in California and is using that power to really hold the evil forces of fossil fuel accountable through litigation. And we're very excited to hear more about that today. So welcome, Ben Franta.
Thank you all very much. It's really nice to be here. Every time I come to Amsterdam, I think, why don't I live here? Such a beautiful city, and so incredible historically and culturally. So yeah, really nice to be here with you. We're going to talk today about legal action and climate change. I was thinking this morning how to think about climate change in this systems thinking way. And often we think about climate change as a scientific problem or an economic problem or even a problem of capitalism. But we can also think about it in terms of a problem of accountability versus impunity. And that's another way to think about it, about this problem historically, because it turns out a lot of people, including the fossil fuel industry, have known about climate science and climate change and the impacts of climate change for a long time, many decades, and decided to make this happen in order to continue with the status quo and continue to profit in their particular businesses. So, there's this sort of level of impunity and of course we see this around the world in general, in our politics today, in war, in many arenas. And so, this is another way to think about it. And how do we fight back against impunity? Well, there are many ways, but one way is through the power of law. And law is part of the problem. It can be part of the solution as well, in my opinion. It's one of the arenas in society in which there is at least somewhat, or can be somewhat, of a level playing field between forces that are very unequal in terms of their societal and economic and political power is in the courtroom. And it's one of the few places we have in society where we can hold very powerful corporations to account and force them to answer and force them to hand over their internal documents so that they can see the light of day and the truth can be shared with more of society. So it's not perfect. And of course, the law is corruptible and the law is corrupted, but it can be also part of the solution. At least I hope it can be. And so for the last 6-7 years, I've been very engaged with using lawsuits to address climate change, using lawsuits to hold fossil fuel companies accountable in particular, although there are also lawsuits against governments. And so there's a wide range. We'll talk about those today. But I want to start with this video. This is a video of the Attorney General of California announcing a few years ago that they're launching a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, BP, American Petroleum Institute, the big carbon majors, for deceiving the public about climate change, making money through that deception, and causing huge amounts of damage through climate change. And what I find very interesting about this video is that there's a lot that's being said here that perhaps we have heard before, but from different voices, from activist groups or NGOs who've been saying things like this for quite a while, But now we have government officials and lawyers, other sort of messengers, also saying this with the power of law, and they're pursuing this case, very vigorously with resources dedicated to that. So very high stakes. So I just thought we would share in this and watch this. We won't watch the whole thing. We'll watch like 4 minutes of it. Warning, there's a little bit of California bragging in this video about how great California is. Just ignore that. It's a great, beautiful place too, but lots of great places around the world.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. Excited to be here with our great, courageous, and bold governor and to announce a very important lawsuit that we filed on Friday, late night in San Francisco Superior Court in California, where we are suing some of the biggest fossil fuel industry leaders, big oil, from ConocoPhillips to BP to Chevron, Shell, ExxonMobil, as well as the American Petroleum Institute, in a first of its kind, watershed, historic, unprecedented lawsuit by the biggest state in the nation, the soon to be fourth largest economy in the world, the largest geographic area, and the biggest economy yet to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for lying about it. That is the essence of it. It's that deception, those misleading statements, that falsifying over decades, 60, 70 years, and we have a very detailed complaint full of evidence showing studies that were commissioned and internal memos and internal dialogue where leaders of these big oil companies knew exactly what fossil fuel did to the climate change, the increased heat. They predicted very accurately where we are today. They knew it was coming and they did it anyway. And they, while they huddled internally and privately and told the truth to one another about the facts and science of climate change, they lied to the rest of the world. And so we have a detailed complaint that has a number of different causes of action. It is the most sweeping complaint thus far to sue these companies for fueling climate change and for deceiving. It has a public nuisance claim. It has a destruction of natural resources claim. It has a number of false and misleading statement and deception claims. It has failure to warn claims in it as well. And the main remedy it seeks is an abatement fund to abate and mitigate the impacts of climate change. As the governor has said many times, as the hots get hotter, as the wets get wetter, the dries get drier, that has impact on people and on natural resources and on our state. And right now, the big oil companies have pushed the costs all into the people, to the taxpayers and everyday folks who are sick because of the air that they breathe or are suffering because of the heat that they work in, who can't afford insurance or are getting insurance pulled away from them, who are losing their homes, losing their farms. Those are all costs that are externalized, that are borne by the people because of the acts and conducts of big oil companies. So they need to be held accountable. They need to pay for the damage that they caused, that they knew about. They knew for years. They knew where we would be today. They predicted it accurately. And that in their endless pursuit, their unquenchable thirst for billions of dollars of profit year after year, 200 billion last year, they continued to lie so they could profit while the planet burned, California burned, flooded, suffered drought, suffered superstorms. So we believe that this is a historic moment. We hope that this will be an inspiration to other states and other entities to get involved, to join us, to sue, to be part of an effort to hold an industry accountable that has not been held accountable for too long. And I just want to end with this. This is personal. This is personal to a lot of us. The governor shared some very personal statements earlier today about one of his children. I have the same experience. I have my oldest daughter told me in high school. She's now 24 years old. I'm going to brag here for a second. She's a professional soccer player. But she told me when she was in high school, she said, "Dad, I love our family. My younger brother, my younger sister, mom and dad, and I want to have a family of my own someday. I've always dreamed about that, but right now I don't think I can. I don't think I should, and I'm not planning on it. I don't think it's responsible to bring a new life into a dying planet." And she's worried whether she can have a planet, have a family to enjoy with. And we have a responsibility to do more. California is doing what we do here, leading, leaning in, being bold, being strong, being aggressive, and holding to account an industry that has not been held to account for too long. So We're happy to answer some questions, but very, very, very proud to be.
Ready to step aside and let's just do Q&A.
Okay. All right, so thanks. Yeah, are there any sort of reactions or responses to that, to seeing that? Yeah.
But I'm also wondering about the rules. Knowing for years that because mistakes are fine, they can be made, but it's possible so much precious time. Because we had it in earlier talks, it's not only about the level of change, but also the rate of change, and now we need to adapt so quickly at other costs, so the time that we miss, that's actually important.
Very good point. Somebody a few years ago coined this phrase predatory delay. Sometimes we talk about delay as if it's an innocuous thing or we just waited a little longer. But actually this problem, because it's irreversible essentially, and the timescales of change are also long. It takes time to switch out fossil fuels with other energy sources. That delay bakes in more damage, right? So I think it's a really good point. It's lost time. Yeah, there was another hand up before, and we'll get to this.
Maybe it's a bit controversial perspective, but isn't it too easy to point the finger only at the fossil fuel companies? Because it's easy to say they are guilty or think that they are guilty, but I can extract as much as fossil fuels I want, but if you don't buy it, I'm gonna pay tomorrow. So it's a collective error, not a scapegoat. Let's say, let's accuse the fossil fuel companies, and all of us, then they are free, morally free, let's say, or legally free to behave as they want.
Yes, it's a really interesting point. It brings up this question of how is responsibility distributed, right, across society? And there's some maybe philosophical or moral answers we might come up with for that. But there are also legal answers. And so I think that's another value of the law, is that these questions have been considered by the law before. How do we apportion responsibility when there is a very damaging product, for example, that's put on the market? What's the allocation of responsibility between consumers, the producers, and say the governments who regulate? And that's something that in asbestos litigation or tobacco litigation, these things are also addressed. So it's a really good question. I think, that's something we could get into for a long time, I think, but a short answer is that the law has special duties for producers of products that consumers don't share. So the responsibility to know about the product at the level of an expert. That's a duty of manufacturers of products. The duty to warn about harms that may arise from those products. The duty to not make an unnecessarily harmful product. That's kind of an interesting question. Like, courts found that cigarettes were defective, actually legally defective, because they're made more addictive than they need to be, actually. They're engineered to be addictive, so they're unnecessarily harmful. Maybe energy producers are making an unnecessarily harmful product when they supply energy. They know there are safer ways to supply the energy. For example, I don't know the final answer to that, but it's something we can think about how to apportion that responsibility. Great point. Yeah.
What was the result from this?
It's ongoing. It's ongoing. And there are about maybe 30 or so lawsuits like this ongoing across the US. And we'll talk about lawsuits outside the US as well, in Europe and elsewhere. And recently the Supreme Court of the US has decided to listen to an appeal from the oil companies. And oil companies are saying these lawsuits should not exist. Basically, that climate change is too big of an issue for these courts to have jurisdiction over. And Supreme Court said we will hear that appeal, or that they would hear the appeal. So I think we're waiting with bated breath, see what will happen with that appeal.
But it's a Trump Supreme Court, so.
Yes, it's Trump Supreme Court, so it is likely to be friendly to the oil.
There's a question here as well.
Yes.
It's more of a reply, I would say, because I think that this causal link is given by numbers. Like these fossil fuel companies act as catalyzers of this increase in the probability of heat waves. Like they make 10,000 more likely a heat wave to happen, in respect to the pre-industrial climate. So this makes the whole difference. It's not just a weak causal link, it's a direct causal link of 10,000 times more likely probability to have an heat wave. So you can sue them.
They made these only to us consuming it. If they just extract it and we don't consume it.
Yeah, but
that's
a
kosher
thing to consider.
And that was what the whole of previous was about.
Yeah.
It's like cigarettes, if I don't smoke them.
Okay, maybe this is a lunch.
Great. Well, maybe two more and then we'll move on. Three more and then we'll.
Yes, I was just wondering, with regards to having their, let's say, the lawyer California, but also on beside the governor of California. And that, I mean, how does that play out? Gavin Newsom is a political figure, more or less controversial. He has a political agenda at the same time. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, the Attorney General of the state is sort of a political figure as well. And so when they launch a major lawsuit like this, they'll do so with the blessing of the governor, and of course, an attorney general, if they win a big case or make a big name for themselves, they might also run for governor or something like that. So there are politics involved in all this, of course. And it's a really, I think, astute observation of that dimension to this as well.
Just so curious about the demands. So clearly you want to first win this, and then there will be fines paid, I guess, by these companies. I forgot they mentioned the amounts. But maybe paying those fines is not that big of a deal on the amount. So I was also thinking, if you knew you could win, what would you actually demand of the fossil fuel industry, right? Did they dismantle themselves? Or, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, great question. I mean, what would you demand? If you could demand anything, let's say you came to the settlement table and the fossil fuels company said, we want to get out of this lawsuit. We're willing to negotiate. What would you ask for?
Realistic plan for transitioning their whole business.
Yeah, so like a transition.
And I guess cleanup.
Cleanup. And what is cleanup look like?
Well, I'm thinking of the case with Nigeria, that's for cleaning up oil spills and actually not just abandoning infrastructure. Yes.
Reparations, yeah, so payment, compensation for communities that are affected.
Definitely the least responsible.
Yeah. So incorporating social justice as well. Any other thoughts? Like, what would you ask for? What would you seek? You have leverage over these companies. Lawsuit. Yeah.
Just that they have to pay for all their externalities. Any negative externalities, they have to cover the cost.
Paying for the damage of climate change.
Pollution, energy emissions.
Yeah. What else?
Yeah, I would add to this, since they knew what they were doing. Before that, I don't know, I find it difficult to blame them because we're here because of fossil fuel. But since they knew what they were doing, I find from them they were responsible. So for the increased cost that it takes us now to transition in 10 instead of 30 years, they're responsible.
Very interesting. So maybe there's a cutoff year or something. Okay.
Sure, jail time.
Jail then, yeah, criminal liability. Okay. Some people are talking about that actually, so, yeah. What else? Yes.
I would also think about system change, so like stepping away from privatizing and
So maybe the companies would go into some sort of public receivership where they're owned and managed and operated by the public government or something. Like this.
Is it possible, for example, because you were talking about operations, which was also the first word that came to my mind, because it's not just about compensation, it's just about like paying for something for the future, but also preparing something in the past, and was not like compensable with money. And also it's not necessarily within the right systems, because it might be that the right system within they are being like accused is not the one in which they are doing the damage. So is it possible, for example, to add those words in a more international way?
Yeah. So international operations.
And also based on the needs of the communities that have been like, harmed.
And then maybe we're running up against the limits of the laws. How do things work internationally, even if that would be more fair? But the law actually do that. Maybe those few more suggestions. Maybe just throw them out there and I won't say anything. I'm just using more time.
I think as they were saying, they have done so much damage over the last 50, 60 years, it's not recoverable, honestly, like in terms of loss, deaths and damages. First thing they could ask them, like just return the subsidies they have provided them over the 60 years with interest. And just like you got like, 500 million back in the 80s, and now with interest, what would be the equivalent money in 2026? Pay that, pack your bags, leave the state, don't make us fourth largest economy in the world, And then on top of it, I mean, he has a lot of powers as a governor. He can do constitutionally in law a lot of things to change how they operate within the state before he becomes a president. And lastly, he's gonna change his position. He's running for president. 2028, so he's gonna be asked that question a lot. Then we'll see what he says.
Good points. Who haven't spoken yet? Yeah.
Let's say prevent them from lobbying at the highest level in settings where people see them are made prevent them from pursuing their investment acts without taking into account any cost in this very sense. That I would say also propose or fund some information campaigns regarding that climate situation. So I see them as they finding this propaganda that is pro oil and anti-climate emergency. So to reverse that as well. So more ideas that are in favor of our the planet that can space for them to be diseased. Okay.
So I'm thinking on the economic side, if we as large private companies pay for their externalities, this means a huge reduction of the revenue and their anticipated revenue. So is there a way to make them accept that?
Will they do that willingly?
We didn't know, I'm sure that we know, but to accept it. And I mean, probably there will be change if they don't accept it. In order to keep their capital, they will shift their model somehow. Or if it's too unprofitable, this activity, they will shift to something else to continue having a specific revenue. So what could be an argument, because in their ears, they want to hear revenue talk, not ethical talk. So how could we strategize specific language to do this and achieve indeed our goal.
Yeah, I think I hear you. I think it's change the economics of fossil fuel business and making them pay for the damages or all these things that they may, I don't know, but it incentivize them. Is that what you're saying?
I feel like we should offer, if we say we will stay in this system and we don't talk about it, and another trajectory, should offer another model for them to stay. If it's this system, another system, it's another discussion.
So like an escape hatch.
I think it's how it works.
Yeah. It makes sense. Realistically, politically. Thank you all very much for that. I mean, it's amazing how much in discussion and how many aspects to this are generated. So I'm just going to go quickly through some slides and then we can have more discussion. That's the video we just saw. So this shows the number of climate-related lawsuits filed each year for the last 20 years or so. And I think the main takeaway here is just that now this is an issue that the courts are looking at frequently. So how exactly you define climate-related lawsuit is a little bit arbitrary, and this is also why it goes up sometimes and down sometimes. But I think the point here is that in the early 2000s, it was a much different situation than what we have now, where climate-related cases are much more common. And they're distributed around the world, not uniformly. There are many cases in the US. There's a lot of litigation in the US, but there's a lot of climate litigation outside the US as well. So, you know, some of the hot spots are Brazil, Australia, the UK, Europe in general, and other places too. And these cases are growing over time in these different jurisdictions. Looking at the US, we saw this California case. It's one of about 30, 40 different cases that are all based on this case theory of deception by the fossil fuel companies. So it's a similar template to tobacco litigation, opioids litigation, if you've heard about that, against pharmaceutical companies. So it's a standard, tried and tested approach for corporate accountability. Doesn't always succeed. This is probably the biggest attempt yet, and monetarily, in terms of the liability involved here. This would be trillions of dollars involved here to make these companies pay for climate change. But there is a big industry of lawyers who do these kinds of cases, who have spent decades doing these cases. They know how to win them. They know how to argue them. They have money. They have hundreds of millions of dollars available to spend in their firms to do these cases, because if they win, then they'll get some of the proceeds. And so it's a business for them as well. So that's an interesting twist here, where it's not just NGOs, nonprofits, and environmental groups, even though these are lawyers who are doing this because they are focused on the environment, but in social justice, corporate accountability, but it's a different type of player than perhaps we have seen before in the climate space. And there's many different kinds of cases. So here's one case which was filed in the state of Oregon, and it just focuses on one particular event. So the California case is about all the damages from climate change in the state of California. They haven't really been quantified yet. They're presumably hundreds of billions of dollars in the state of California. This is for one heat wave. And there's an attribution study that shows that this heat wave was made virtually impossible without climate change. So there's strong causal evidence. But just this one heat wave, they're seeking about $50 billion, mostly in future adaptation costs. And so you can imagine how these could multiply if that case theory is successful. There's been a wrongful death suit filed. So this is a civil suit against fossil fuel companies for regarding someone who died during this heat wave, and their family filed a wrongful death suit against fossil fuel companies, which again, very interesting framing, because it's one thing to talk about this sort of they should pay for actually killing people, but to file a lawsuit and to make the argument in court and to potentially force these companies to pay for that, it's at a different level. Some of these cases focus on misleading advertising, misleading communication. So this case by Massachusetts against Exxon focuses on that. And in their complaint, they make the comparison to tobacco companies. And here's an example of a tobacco ad, which doesn't contain any factual lie. There's no statement in there that is factually false, by the nature of the ad, but we would still recognize this as misleading because it's associating health and beauty and wellness with smoking, right? And so a lot of the advertisements from the fossil fuel companies are kind of similar. It's like maybe they're not saying something that is technically a lie, but it is associating their company with sustainability, things like that. Here's a very interesting case filed by the state of Michigan, based on an antitrust argument. It is alleging that the fossil fuel companies unlawfully suppressed renewable energy since the 1970s, through defensive acquisitions of patents, defensive acquisitions of startups, things like that. So very interesting. And in their case, they say the only thing that broke that was China in the 2010s deciding that they were going to dominate electric vehicles and solar. And then that finally has sort of broken that stalling from the carbon majors. I don't know. It's a very interesting sort of historical argument they're making. More cases are being discussed regarding insurance. So some areas are becoming uninsurable, or insurance premiums are rising because of climate change. And who should pay for that? Should the fossil fuel companies pay for that? This is in the state of Hawaii. They're talking about introducing legislation that would allow to force the fossil fuel companies to pay for that. Other suits are suing fossil fuel companies for their own failure to adapt to climate change, like they're adapting their coastal facilities, refineries, and so on to climate change. So it's an interesting twist. And then yet more cases are against governments, saying the government owes a duty of care to people, to protect them from climate change, or a stable climate is a constitutional right. There's a lot of cases brought by youth plaintiffs based on this theory, and some of them have been successful. This was a successful case in the state of Hawaii. And somebody mentioned jail, criminal prosecution, and this hasn't happened yet. There have been no criminal cases sort of started against fossil fuel companies yet, but it's something that's being discussed more and more. In some jurisdictions, it's a crime to cause a catastrophe. We think about homicide, and this could fit within homicide, but there are broader crimes as well that are more to do with, generally creating disasters and stuff like that might fit. This is some interesting public opinion polling, which finds that even conservatives tend to be supportive of these cases, not as much as progressives, but still quite a bit. So it's something about this corporate accountability lens that cuts across political lines more than what we're used to with climate. Okay, leaving the US, there's a lot of interesting climate litigation going on outside the US as well. You've probably heard about the Urgenda case here in the Netherlands, which was very groundbreaking. That was against the government for Paris alignment, essentially. There's been another interesting case in the Netherlands regarding Bonaire and the government's duty to help Bonaire adapt to climate change impacts. That was successful recently. So yeah, very interesting case theory. The case against Shell, so trying to force Shell to align with the Paris Agreement, was successful in the lower court, was kind of reversed, partly reversed in the appeals court. So Shell escaped that remedy that was ordered to force the company to move away from fossil fuels, but that case is being appealed also. And there were some things said in that latest decision that were useful for future cases. So for example, the judges said in this appeal, they said, well, maybe we don't really know exactly how Shell should decarbonize to align with the Paris Agreement. Maybe there are many ways that Shell can do that. So we're a little uncomfortable ordering Shell to decarbonize in a certain pathway. But some things seem more obvious, like any sort of new oil and gas exploration seems obviously incompatible with the Paris Agreement. But the plaintiffs didn't ask for that here. But Milieu Defense just filed or announced they're filing a new case against Shell, which asks for that now. It just says like, there's a red line here, which says no new oil and gas exploration because it's categorically incompatible with the Paris Agreement. So you can see how these cases, even when they don't fully succeed, sometimes they get a little win that's used to ratchet up the pressure in the next case. There's a similar case or a damages case actually in Peru against a German power utility. This is the RWE case, the Yuya case it's called as well. And again, that was unsuccessful because the court found that the damage had not yet occurred and it was too speculative, but that legally the case could work if the plaintiffs had simply alleged something that was maybe had already happened. And so already there are new cases being announced that do that. So you can see how this is working. There's a case in Italy against Eni, which is similar. And then there are these transnational cases like the Peru case, where you have plaintiffs in one country suing a defendant in another country. This is plaintiffs in Indonesia suing a Swiss cement producer, Holcim, in Switzerland for damages in Indonesia. Very similar case has been announced in the UK against Shell to do with a typhoon that hit the Philippines in, I think, 2021. So you could see also this is a totally different kind of a case, these transnational cases. And what's interesting there legally is that in those cases, you can use the law of, say, the Philippines. So you use the substantive law of the Philippines, which can be very progressive, environmental law, and you use the procedural law of where the case is proceeding. So in the UK, so that could take advantage of the courts, how they operate in the UK, but using the progressive laws, say, in the Philippines. So the world is sort of a big strategic sort of map in that sense, that you can imagine all the combinations of cases that could be brought. Other cases are to do with greenwashing, and I'll skip through these. There's just lots of cases going on. International courts, advisory opinions. The biggest one is probably the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, which will lay the groundwork for future cases. So I'm just going to make like 2 points, I think, before we finish. But they're kind of like 2-minute long points each. So they're like a little bigger than, but it's to do with the evidence of the deception and the ongoing development in climate attribution science, like we were talking about the heat waves, which is really important for these cases. And, this is the sort of evidence I think that also changes the game on climate. When you see the documents from the fossil fuel companies, this is a document from Exxon in 1982. Exxon had a secret internal research program about climate change from the late 70s to the mid 80s. And it was only recently discovered. And, here's a page from that report, which shows Exxon's projections of how much CO2 buildup there would be in the atmosphere over time and how much global warming that would cause. And it's just about exactly right. By 2026, it's about 420 parts per million. and about 1.3, 1.4 degrees Celsius warming. So it's really on point and, you know, predicting many of the impacts that we're seeing, potentially catastrophic effects. These are Exxon's words: flooding, climate-related famine and migration, that adaptation would be expensive. And there's a lot of documents like this. This is another Exxon document which talks about how to avoid disastrous climate change. This was written in 1979, and it models out, okay, how do we make it so that emissions peak around the year 2000 and go back down? And how do we limit the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? And so they modeled that out. Here's what would be required. Okay, we can never develop shale gas, shale oil. 80% of fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. So keep it in the ground slogan was actually known by Exxon in 1979. Yeah, so that idea that there was an alternative, I think that's also very important here. This is not the inevitable consequence of history, but there were choices made which made these disastrous outcomes occur. And that sort of also gets to the accountability question. You know, why should they be accountable? Who is responsible here? I'll skip this. This is just another industry-wide task force on climate change from the 80s, but you can see this is some of their notes, and it says it predicts the impacts by 2070, globally catastrophic effects with more fossil fuels. And this is such a powerful document. Since we're in the Netherlands, I thought it would be amazing to include this. This is a Shell Scenarios report from 1989, which was discovered by a graduate student here in the Netherlands just a few years ago. So you too can discover amazing documents. They're still out there for sure. But it's all about climate change. And kind of like that Exxon report, here Shell has two scenarios. On the left, this is annual emissions. So in one scenario, annual emissions peak around the year 2000 and go down. That's SW scenario, sustainable world.
Awesome.
Yeah. And then yeah, exactly. That's the best response I've gotten from this. And then the other one is global mercantilism. So it's kind of like that. Yeah, global unfettered corporate, you know, markets or something. And then on the right is the CO2 concentration. And then, you know, I just find this really powerful. It's, you know, quoting from Shell's report here. What would happen if fossil fuels continued to be used? Yeah. Yeah. So Shell had this scenarios development sort of division or department, and it was actually like led by like one or two people for decades. There's somebody named Art Kleiner, I think, who put a lot of these together. Yeah. And so, you know, and other Shell scenario reports from the 90s, they predict climate litigation. They say in the 2010s, there will be hurricanes that hit, they say, the East Coast of the US, and there will be lawsuits against fossil fuel companies for damages, basically. And so they predicted that happening too, back in their reports from the 90s. Yeah.
So, sorry for interrupting. I think we will have to move on.
Sure.
soon. And Ben is here until Friday, and he will join the evening, so there will be plenty of opportunity to ask your questions.
Sure.
So, is this a good? Well, so if you take a couple of more minutes to
Sure.
wrap up, and then we save questions.
I will wrap. Thank you so much. And it's very helpful because otherwise I'll just keep going. So I really appreciate it, actually. I'll finish with just the very important things, which is that we know this history, and then we also know the history of the deception, where they told people it's not a big deal, climate change is not really happening, here's just an example of that. The 90s, just saying climate change is not real, contradicting their earlier knowledge. And this was a recent article, when the Wall Street Journal comes after you as a corporation, as Exxon, that you're in trouble. And this is what Exxon's CEO said: I know it looks bad, but now they're solving the problem, so it doesn't really matter what happened in the past. But if you look at what they're actually investing in renewables, it's still nothing or very low. This is the American company's CapEx in renewables, and it's at 0%. And European majors are higher, but still majority in oil and gas. And so, we can also look at what these companies are saying now. This is a screenshot of a big database we have of climate advertising from fossil fuel companies. We have about 3,000 unique ads spanning 20 years, which you can access and use for your research if you'd like. It's online. Things like this: Exxon creating climate solutions, clean energy from hydrogen, biofuels, and many of these claims are arguably misleading, and the law could do something about that too. And then the last thing I'll say is just that this climate attribution science is also advancing, which is the causation part of these cases. It's saying this damage was caused by climate change. And these companies made climate change worse by lying about it, essentially. And so this is also very important. And, much of this is being published in very high-profile publications like Nature. So it's becoming quite well established. And sometimes it's very sort of straightforward, like, here's how much LA County needs to pay to change its pavement because it's raining more there, or there's sewer systems. So sometimes it's just very straightforward as well, what the costs are. And some states are actually passing laws to force fossil fuel companies to pay for climate change just through a legislative solution. So Vermont did this, New York State did this, other states are also discussing this. Very interesting. So I'll leave it at that. And I think, I know this is about systems thinking, right? And so how do you see this injection of this activity? There's new players involved now. There's new lawyers involved. There's a new discussion. There's a lot of money at stake. These cases are worth trillions of dollars, biggest mass tort cases filed ever in the history of law. The damages are just accumulating. The historical evidence is quite damning, and it's only growing over time. How does this change the situation with climate change and how we address it and the politics of climate change, things like that? So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much